In the harsh New Mexico territory of 1885, a grieving rancher's world turned upside down when he rescued a traumatized Apache girl being hunted by raiders. But when her educated mother appeared challenging every assumption the town held about savages, he faced an impossible choice: abandon the family that brought light back to his life, or stand against an entire community consumed by prejudice. Sometimes love means fighting the whole world, but what happens when the whole world fights back? Don't forget to like this video and tell us where you are watching from in the comments below. You chose them over us. Rancher's decision to protect Apache widow cost him everything. The late afternoon sun blazed mercilessly across the New Mexico territory, turning the scrubland into a shimmering furnace of heat and dust. Caleb Morrison rode his bay mare slowly along the fence line, checking for breaks after the previous night's storm. At 35, he moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that rushing only brought disappointment and grief. The scar across his weathered hands told the story of 15 years working this harsh land. But the deeper scars, the ones that couldn't be seen, spoke of losses that no amount of hard work could heal. 3 years had passed since he'd buried his wife Margaret beneath the cottonwood tree behind the cabin. 3 years since he'd laid their unborn son beside her in the same grave. 3 years of silence that stretched longer with each passing season. Caleb pulled up his horse and squinted toward the horizon. Something moved in the distance, stumbling across the open ground. At first he thought it might be a wounded animal, but as he rode closer, his heart lurched. It was a child. A little girl, perhaps 6 years old, staggered through the brush. Her long black hair hung in tangled strands around her face. Her doe-skin dress, torn and stained with blood and dirt, barely covered her thin frame. Scratches covered her arms and legs, and her bare feet left small spots of blood on the rocky ground. But it wasn't just her appearance that made Caleb's chest tighten with dread. Behind her, perhaps a mile distant, dust clouds rose from the desert floor. Riders, and they were coming fast. The child stumbled and fell, tried to rise, then collapsed again. She turned her face toward the approaching sound of hoofbeats, and even from a distance, Caleb could see the terror in her dark eyes. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse forward. The mare responded instantly, covering the ground between them in long strides. As they drew near, the child tried to crawl away, whimpering softly in a language he didn't understand. "Easy, little one," Caleb murmured, dismounting carefully. He kept his hands visible and his voice gentle. "I won't hurt you." The girl's eyes darted between his face and the approaching dust cloud. She said something in Apache, her voice barely above a whisper. Though he couldn't understand the words, her meaning was clear. They were coming for her. Caleb looked back toward the riders. Maybe 8 men, still too far to make out clearly, but riding hard. His jaw tightened as he made a split-second decision that would change everything. "Come here, sweetheart," he said softly, extending his hand. "I'm going to get you somewhere safe." For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Then, with a bomb that tore at his heart, she stumbled toward him, and he scooped her up, surprised by how light she felt, how fragile. Her small arms wrapped around his neck with desperate strength. "Hold tight," he whispered, mounting the horse with practiced ease despite her weight. "We're going home." The mare seemed to sense the urgency. She stretched into a gallop, carrying them across the rough terrain toward the distant cabin. Behind them, the dust cloud grew larger. The riders had spotted them. Caleb's cabin sat in a natural depression, was surrounded by low hills and scattered juniper trees. It wasn't much to look at. Rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud, a stone chimney that needed repair, and a small corral where his other horses waited. But it was defensible, and more importantly, it was home. He carried the child inside, kicking the door shut behind him. She clung to him still, her small body trembling. In the dim light of the cabin, he could see her injuries more clearly. Cuts and bruises covered her arms and legs. A gash on her forehead had bled freely, matting her hair. But her eyes held a depth of trauma that no child should ever carry. "Let me help you," he said gently, trying to set her down. She shook her head violently, tightening her grip around his neck. Her lips moved silently, but no sound came out. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She wasn't just frightened. She couldn't, or wouldn't, speak. Outside, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Caleb moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. 8 men on horseback had stopped at the edge of his property. They wore a mix of cavalry uniforms and civilian clothes, their faces hard beneath broad-brimmed hats. Two of them carried rifles across their saddles. The leader, a man with sergeant's stripes and a grizzled beard, called out, "Morrison, we know you're in there. Send out the Apache girl, and there won't be any trouble." Caleb's grip tightened on the child. She had begun to shake again at the sound of the man's voice. Whatever these men had done to her family, whatever she had witnessed, had left scars deeper than any physical wound. "What do you want with her?" Caleb called back, not opening the door. "She's a witness to an Apache raid 3 days ago. We need her for questioning." "She's just a child, and she's hurt." "Apache children grow up to be Apache warriors," another voice shouted. "Best to deal with the problem now." The casual cruelty in those words made Caleb's blood run cold. He looked down at the girl in his arms, at her small, frightened face, and the intelligence that shone in her dark eyes despite her terror. This wasn't justice. This was murder disguised as duty. "She stays with me," he called out, his voice carrying the finality of a man who had made his choice. A long silence stretched between the cabin and the riders. Then the sergeant spoke again, his tone harder now. "You're making a mistake, Morrison. Harboring an Apache is a serious offense. We'll be back with papers from the territorial governor." "Legal papers." "You do that," Caleb replied. "Until then, this child is under my protection." The riders lingered for another few minutes, their voices carrying on the wind in heated discussion. Finally, they wheeled their horses and rode away, but not before the sergeant's final warning drifted back. 3 days, Morrison. 3 days to come to your senses." As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Caleb became aware of how quiet the cabin had become. The child had stopped, trembling, but still clung to him with desperate intensity. He walked slowly to his chair by the fireplace and sat down, adjusting her position so she could rest more comfortably. "Well, little one," he said softly, "looks like it's just you and me for now." She lifted her head to look at him, studying his face with the gravity of someone much older. Her lips moved slightly, forming what might have been words, but still no sound came. Caleb had seen this before during his brief stint as a cavalry scout years ago. Children who had witnessed too much violence sometimes retreated into silence, their voices locked away with their memories. It might take days, weeks, or months before they felt safe enough to speak again. Some never did. "You don't have to talk," he told her. "When you're ready, I'll listen. Until then, let's get you cleaned up and fed." He carried her to the kitchen area and set her gently on a chair. She watched his every movement as he heated water on the stove and gathered clean rags. When he approached with a warm, damp cloth, she flinched but didn't pull away. "This might sting a little," he warned before beginning to clean the cut on her forehead. She bore the treatment with stoic silence, never taking her eyes from his face. It was as if she was studying him, trying to determine whether he could be trusted or if he was simply another threat wearing a kinder mask. As he worked, Caleb found himself talking to her in the gentle tone he had once used with the horses. He told her about the cabin, about the chickens in the yard, about how the mountains looked different in each season. She didn't respond, but her breathing gradually steadied and some of the rigid tension left her small frame. When he finished tending her wounds, he opened a can of beans and warmed them on the stove. She ate slowly, cautiously, as if expecting the food to be taken away at any moment. Between bites, her gaze kept drifting to the windows, watching for signs of the rider's return. "They won't come back today," Caleb assured her, "and if they do, I'll be ready." As evening shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, Caleb faced a problem he hadn't anticipated. Where would she sleep? His own bed seemed too large and strange for such a small, traumatized child. After some thought, he pulled the cushions from his chair and arranged them on the floor near the fireplace, covering them with his warmest quilt. The child watched these preparations with interest, but said nothing when he gestured toward the makeshift bed. Instead, she looked toward the door, then back at him, a question clear in her expression. "I'll be right here," he promised, settling into his chair with a rifle across his knees. "Mumming will hurt you tonight." For the first time since he'd found her, something that might have been relief flickered across her features. She curled up on the cushions, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Her dark eyes remained fixed on his face until exhaustion finally claimed her. Caleb sat watch through the long night, listening to her soft breathing and the settling sounds of the cabin around them. Outside, coyotes called across the desert, their voices carrying ancient sorrows that seemed to echo his own. He thought about Margaret, about the child they had lost before birth, about the empty years since. He thought about the choice he had made that afternoon and what it might cost him. The territorial authorities wouldn't give up easily. When they returned, they would come with more men and legal justification for their actions. But as he watched the sleeping child, saw how peacefully she rested for the first time, perhaps in days he knew he wouldn't change his decision. Some things mattered more than the law. Some things mattered more than safety. The protection of innocence was one of them. Dawn came pale and cold, filtering through the gaps in the cabin's shutters. Caleb woke stiff from sleeping in his chair, the rifle still balanced across his knees. The child was stirring on her makeshift bed, sitting up slowly and looking around the cabin as if trying to remember where she was. When her gaze found his, she offered the tiniest suggestion of a smile. It transformed her entire face, revealing a glimpse of the spirited little girl she must have been before trauma silenced her voice. "Good morning, sweetheart," Caleb said softly. "How are you feeling?" She touched the bandage on her forehead gingerly, then nodded once. Better, the gesture seemed to say. Not healed, but better. Caleb stood slowly, working the kinks out of his back. "How about some breakfast? I make terrible coffee, but my flapjacks aren't bad." For the first time, he saw something that might have been amusement flicker in her eyes. She nodded more enthusiastically, and he felt a small surge of hope. Perhaps with time and patience, she might find her voice again. As he prepared breakfast, she wandered around the cabin, examining everything with the careful curiosity of an intelligent child. She stopped before the mantelpiece where a small daguerreotype of Margaret sat in a simple frame. Her fingers traced the glass gently, and she looked back at him with a question in her eyes. "My wife," Caleb said simply. "She died 3 years ago." And the child studied the photograph for a long moment, then looked at him with an expression of startling maturity. She understood loss. She understood grief. In her own silent way, she was offering him comfort. They ate breakfast in companionable silence. She had a healthy appetite and seemed to enjoy the flapjack syrup running down her chin as she ate. Caleb found himself smiling, while really smiling for the first time in months. But their peaceful morning was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching at a leisurely pace. Caleb tensed his hand, moving instinctively toward his rifle, but a glance through the window showed only a single rider. Wilson, the traveling trader, who came through every few months with supplies and news from town. The child had heard the hoof beats too. She pressed close to Caleb's side, her small hand clutching his sleeve. "It's all right," he murmured. "This one's a friend." But as Wilson rode into the yard and dismounted, Caleb wondered if that would still be true after the man saw who was living in his cabin. Wilson was a lean man in his 50s, with graying whiskers and clothes that had seen too many miles of dusty trail. He had been coming to the cabin for 5 years, ever since Caleb had settled on this land, and they had developed an easy friendship based on mutual respect in Wilson's endless supply of stories from the outside world. "Morning, Caleb," Wilson called, tying his horse to the hitching post. "Brought you that coffee you ordered and some news from—" He stopped mid-sentence as his gaze fell on the child standing in the cabin doorway. His eyes widened, taking in her Apache features and traditional dress. Then his gaze shifted to Caleb, confusion and concern warring on his weathered face. "Well," Wilson said slowly, "that's unexpected." Caleb stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Wilson and the child. "Her name is—" He paused, realizing he didn't know her name. She had never spoken it, and he had simply been calling her sweetheart or little one. "She's staying with me for a while." Wilson dismounted fully, his movements careful and deliberate. "Caleb, you know I'm not one to judge a man's choices, but harboring an Apache child, that's dangerous territory. There's been talk in town about recent raids about missing settlers. Folks are scared and angry." "She's not a raider," Caleb said firmly. "She's a frightened little girl who's been through hell." "Maybe so," Wilson replied, "but that's not how others will see it. You need to think about what you're doing here." The child had retreated into the cabin, but Caleb could see her small figure in the shadows listening to every word. He thought about her silence, her terror, when she heard approaching riders, the way she had clung to him, as if he were her only hope of survival. "I have thought about it," he said quietly, "and my decision stands." Wilson studied him for a long moment and then shook his head. "Your business, I suppose, but Caleb, there were soldiers in town yesterday. They were asking questions, looking for someone who fits her description. They'll be back. Let them come. And if they bring federal marshals, If they bring an order from the territorial governor, Caleb met his old friend's gaze steadily. Then they bring them. Wilson sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of Caleb's jaw that meant no amount of arguing would change his mind. All right then, but I hope you know what you're doing. He unloaded the coffee and a few other supplies, but there was a tension in the air now that hadn't been there before. As he prepared to leave, Wilson paused by his horse. Caleb, I've got to ask, why, why risk everything for an Apache child? The question hung in the desert air like heat shimmer. Caleb looked back toward the cabin where the little girl waited in the doorway, watching him with those two old eyes. Because someone has to tell, he said simply, because she's just a child, and children deserve protection no matter who they are or where they come from. Wilson nodded slowly. I hope that it's enough when the time comes. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts and his growing certainty that peaceful days were numbered. But as he turned back toward the cabin, he saw the child step out of the shadows. She walked to him slowly and without a word slipped her small hand into his. The gesture spoke louder than any words could. Whatever came next, they would face it together. That afternoon, Caleb decided it was time to venture beyond the immediate safety of the cabin. The child needed proper clothes, shoes that actually fit, and medical supplies for her wounds. More importantly, she needed to see that the world held more than just fear and hiding. He hitched his wagon and helped her climb up onto the wooden seat beside him. She watched everything with alert interest as they drove toward the small settlement of Mesilla, 12 miles to the south. It wasn't much of a town, just a trading post, a small church, a doctor's office, and a handful of other buildings clustered around a dusty main street. But it was civilization, and it represented both opportunity and danger. As they entered the town, Caleb became acutely aware of the stares that followed them. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people caught sight of the Apache child sitting beside him. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion, and a few displayed outright hostility. He pulled up in front of Dr. Samuel Hayes' office, a small wooden building with a hand-painted sign hanging askew over the door. Dr. Hayes was one of the few men in the territory Caleb truly trusted, a former Army surgeon who had seen enough of war to value peace and human decency above political convenience. Wait here for just a moment, Caleb told the child, helping her down from the wagon. She stayed close to his side as they approached the doctor's door. Dr. Hayes was a tall, thin man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. When he opened the door and saw Caleb with the Apache child, his eyebrows rose, but his expression remained welcoming. Well, this is interesting, he said mildly. Come in, come in. Let me guess, you need medical attention for your young friend here. Caleb felt a wave of relief. No judgment, no questions, just professional concern for a child who needed help. She's been injured, Caleb explained as they entered the small office. Head wound cuts and bruises, and she hasn't spoken since I found her. Hayes examined the child with gentle efficiency, cleaning her wounds properly and applying fresh bandages. Throughout the examination, she remained silent but cooperative, watching the doctor's every movement with careful attention. The physical injuries will heal, Dr. Hayes said quietly to Caleb as he finished his work. But the silence, that's trauma response. She's seen something that shocked her into withdrawing from the world. Time and safety might bring her voice back. Then again, they might not. What can I do to help her? Be patient, be consistent. Don't try to force her to speak. And Dr. Hayes paused, studying Caleb's face. Be prepared for the fact that you might not be able to keep her much longer. What do you mean? Word travels fast in a small territory, Caleb. People are talking about the widowed rancher who's harboring an Apache child. Some of that talk isn't friendly. There are those who believe the only good Apache is a dead Apache regardless of age. The child seemed to sense the seriousness of their conversation. She moved closer to Caleb, her small hand finding his. She stays with me, Caleb said firmly. Dr. Hayes nodded. I thought you might say that. Just be careful, and if you need anything, medical attention, supplies, or even just someone to talk to, you know where to find me. They left the doctor's office and walked toward the trading post. The child's hand remained firmly clasped in Caleb's as they navigated the dusty street. He could feel the weight of watching eyes, hear the murmur of voices as they passed. At the trading post, they purchased shoes, proper clothing, and additional medical supplies. The proprietor, a nervous man named Henderson, completed the transaction quickly, but couldn't quite hide his disapproval. He counted Caleb's money twice as if he expected it to be tainted somehow. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, a group of men emerged from the saloon across the street. Caleb recognized several faces, local ranchers and townspeople he had known for years. Their expressions were not friendly. One of them, a barrel-chested man named Tucker, who ran cattle on the land adjacent to Caleb's, stepped forward. "Morrison," Tucker called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. "Heard you've taken in a pet." Caleb's jaw tightened. "If you have something to say, Tucker, say it plainly." "All right, then. What I've got to say is this: harboring an Apache is bad enough, but bringing one into town, parading her around like she's some kind of family, that's crossing a line." The child pressed closer to Caleb's side. Though she couldn't understand in all the words, the hostility in Tucker's voice was unmistakable. "She's a child," Caleb said quietly. "Nothing more, nothing less." "She's Apache," Tucker spat. "And Apache children grow up to be Apache warriors. You're raising your own future murderer." Several other men nodded in agreement. Caleb could see the mob mentality beginning to form, the way individual doubts and fears combine to create something larger and more dangerous. "I think you should take your Apache and get out of our town," Tucker continued, "before someone decides to do something about the situation." Caleb's hand moved to rest on his gun butt, not drawing, just making it clear that he was armed and prepared to defend himself and the child. The gesture wasn't lost on Tucker and his companions. "Is that a threat, Morrison?" "It's a statement of fact," Caleb replied evenly. "The girl is under my protection. Anyone who wants to harm her will have to go through me first." For a tense moment, the two groups faced each other in the dusty street. Then Tucker laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You're one man, Morrison. Think about that. One man against a whole territory full of people who've lost friends and family to Apache raids. How long do you think you can keep this up?" Without waiting for an answer, Tucker turned and stalked back toward the saloon, his companions following. But as they walked away, Caleb heard one of them mutter, "Won't be long now. Something's got to be done." The child looked up at Caleb with worried eyes, and he squeezed her hand reassuringly. But privately, he wondered if Tucker might be right. How long could one man stand against an entire community's prejudice and fear? They finished loading the wagon in silence and began the journey back to the cabin. The child sat close beside him on the wooden seat, her new shoes dangling over the edge. Despite the confrontation in town, she seemed more alert and engaged than she had since he'd found her. The brief taste of normalcy, new clothes, a kind doctor, the simple act of walking through a town, had awakened something in her. As they crested the hill overlooking his property, Caleb felt a familiar sense of relief at seeing home. But the feeling was short-lived. Smoke was rising from behind the cabin, too much smoke for his small fireplace. His heart racing, he urged the horses into a gallop. As they approached, he could see that someone had set fire to his hay barn. The structure was already half consumed by flames, and the fire was beginning to spread toward the cabin itself. Caleb leaped from the wagon, grabbing buckets and racing toward the well. The child followed, her face pale with fear, but her movements quick and determined. Together they began the desperate task of fighting the fire. It took hours to contain the blaze. By the time the last flames were extinguished, the barn was a total loss, and part of the cabin's roof had been damaged. They stood in the smoky twilight, covered in soot and exhausted, surveying the destruction. A piece of charred paper caught Caleb's attention. He picked it up, recognizing the remnants of a hastily scrawled note. "Last warning, get rid of the Apache or—" The rest was burned away, but the message was clear enough. The child stood beside him, looking at the ruined barn with an expression far too mature for her years. She understood exactly what had happened and why. This destruction was because of her presence, because Caleb had chosen to protect her. She tugged at his sleeve and pointed toward the road, then made a walking motion with her fingers. Her meaning was unmistakable. She should leave. She should walk away to protect him from further trouble. "No," Caleb said firmly, kneeling down to meet her eyes. "No, sweetheart. This is your home now. These people want to scare us, wanted to make us afraid. We're not going to let them win." She studied his face intently, searching for any sign that he was lying, that he was simply being kind before sending her away. Finding none, she nodded slowly and moved closer to him. As they stood together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the smell of smoke and the wreckage of his property, Caleb made a silent promise. Whatever it took, whoever stood against them, he would not abandon this child. She had already lost too much. She would not lose another family, another home, not if he could help it. The fire had been a warning, but it had also been a declaration of war. And Caleb Morrison had never backed down from a fight in his life. He wasn't about to start now. 3 days passed in tense quiet after the barn fire. Caleb worked to repair the damage while keeping constant watch for signs of further trouble. The child, he had taken to calling her Imala, a name that meant disciplined in Apache, though he wasn't sure if it was actually her name, helped as much as her small hands could manage. She had begun to emerge from her shell of silence in small ways. Though she still hadn't spoken, she had started making soft sounds when she was particularly pleased or frightened. She would hum tunelessly while helping with simple chores, and once Caleb had caught her almost laughing at the antics of a bold squirrel that had stolen food from their breakfast. On the morning of the fourth day, as Caleb was replacing damaged roof shingles, Imala suddenly stiffened and pointed toward the eastern horizon. Dust was rising in the distance, a single rider approaching fast. Caleb's first thought was that Tucker and his men had returned to finish what they'd started. He climbed down from the roof, quickly reaching for his rifle. But as the rider drew closer, he realized this was no attack. The figure on horseback was small and slight, riding with the easy grace of someone who had grown up on horseback. As the distance closed, he could see it was a woman, an Apache woman with long black hair streaming behind her in the wind. Imola let out a sound Caleb had never heard from her before. It started as a whimper, rose to something like a puite, and ended in what might have been a word, though spoken so softly he couldn't make it out. The woman on horseback had seen them too. She kicked her mount into a full gallop, racing toward the cabin with desperate urgency. As she drew near enough to make out clearly, Caleb saw that she was young, probably in her late 20s, with high cheekbones and intelligent dark eyes. Her deerskin dress was travel-stained and torn, and she rode with the slight favor of someone nursing an injury. Imala broke away from Caleb's side and ran toward the approaching rider, her small legs carrying her faster than he'd seen her move since the day he'd found her. The woman saw her coming and let out a cry that needed no translation, the universal sound of a mother recognizing her lost child. She practically fell from her horse in her haste to dismount, dropping to her knees just in time to catch Imala in her arms. The reunion was fierce and tearful, both mother and daughter clinging to each other with desperate intensity. The woman spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice breaking with emotion as she examined every inch of her daughter, checking for injuries, reassuring herself that the child was real and whole. Caleb approached slowly, not wanting to intrude on their reunion, but unable to resist moving closer. Up close, he could see that the woman was beautiful in the way that desert flowers were beautiful, stark and striking and perfectly adapted to harsh conditions. But it was her eyes that caught his attention. They held intelligent sorrow and a steel-strong determination that reminded him powerfully of Imala. The woman looked up at him over her daughter's head, and for a moment their gazes met and held. In broken but clear English, she said, You kept her safe." It wasn't a question, but Caleb nodded anyway. "She's a special little girl." "I am Ayana," the woman said, struggling to her feet while keeping one arm around Imala. "This is my daughter Imala. We owe you." She paused, searching for words. "Everything." "You don't owe me anything," Caleb replied. "I'm Caleb Morrison, and you're both welcome here for as long as you need." Ayana studied his face carefully, as if trying to determine whether his words could be trusted. What she saw there must have satisfied her, because some of the rigid tension left her shoulders. "You are hurt," Caleb observed, noticing how carefully she held her left arm. "Bullet graze," she admitted reluctantly. 3 days old, it is not serious." But Caleb could see fever spots on her cheeks and the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of infection setting in. "Let me help you inside. You need medical attention." "I do not wish to." "You're not imposing," Caleb said firmly. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up and fed." He helped Ayana into the cabin, noting how she instinctively cataloged every detail of her surroundings, the weapons within reach, the exits, the potential threats. It was the behavior of someone who had learned the hard way that safety was always temporary. As he tended to her wound, cleaning it properly and applying fresh bandages from his recently acquired supplies. Ayana told him her story in halting English, interspersed with Apache words that Imala quietly translated into gestures. "My husband was killed," she began, her voice steady despite the pain. "Men came to our camp at night. They wore uniforms, but not like soldiers. They killed the men, took the horses, burned our homes. I escaped with Imala, but we became separated in the darkness." "The men who were chasing her," Caleb said, "were they the same when Owens?" Ayana's eyes darkened. "Some were the same. They hunt us still." "Why, what do they want?" Ayana hesitated, glancing at her daughter before answering. My father is Chief Manuelito. He has made peace treaties with your government. These men, they do not want peace. They want war because war brings profit. Contracts for supplies, land for taking reasons to eliminate Apache people." The pieces began to fall into place for Caleb. Ayana wasn't just any Apache woman. She was the daughter of one of the most influential chiefs in the territory, a man whose peace negotiations had prevented countless deaths on both sides. Her murder would be a political catastrophe disguised as an unfortunate casualty of frontier violence. "You speak English very well," he observed. For the first time, Ayana smiled slightly. "I was educated at the mission school in Santa Fe. The priests thought if Apache children learned white ways, there would be less conflict. Perhaps they were right, perhaps not. But I learned to read, to write, to speak your language." This revelation hit Caleb like a physical blow. Here was an educated, intelligent woman who spoke multiple languages and understood both cultures intimately. Yet Tucker and his friends would see only her Apache heritage and judge her as a savage, worthy of nothing but extermination. "How long have you been searching for Amala?" he asked. 6 days. I tracked the men who took her, but I lost the trail in the Badlands. I have been riding in wider and wider circles, looking for any sign." Her voice broke slightly. "I thought I had lost her forever." Imala had been listening to this conversation with grave attention. Now she moved to her mother's side and placed a small hand on her arm. For the first time since Caleb had known her, she spoke. Just one word spoken so softly it was barely audible. "Mama." Ayana's eyes filled with tears. She gathered her daughter close and spoke to her in rapid Apache. Imola responded in the same language, her voice growing stronger with each word. The dam of silence had finally broken. Caleb watched this exchange with mixed emotions. Joy at seeing Amala finally able to speak, but also a growing sadness as he realized that his time with the little girl was probably coming to an end. Ayana would want to take her daughter to safety, away from the dangers that seemed to be converging on his small cabin. But when the conversation between mother and daughter ended, Ayana turned to him with an unexpected request. "Imala tells me you have been kind to her. She tells me she feels safe here." Ayana paused, choosing her words carefully. "I have nowhere else to go. My people are scattered. My husband's clan has been destroyed. If you would allow it, might we stay here, just until I can find safe passage to my father's people?" Caleb felt his heart skip a beat. He had been prepared to say goodbye, to watch them ride away into the dangerous wilderness. The thought of them staying longer filled him with relief and something else, something he wasn't quite ready to name. "Of course," he said quickly. "Stay as long as you need to." But even as he spoke the words, he wondered what new challenges their presence would bring. If harboring one Apache child had drawn threats and violence, what would the townspeople do when they learned he was sheltering the daughter of Chief Manuelito? The answer to that question came sooner than he expected. That afternoon, as Ayana rested and Amala played quietly nearby, the sound of approaching horses drew Caleb to the window. This time there were more riders than before. At least a dozen men led by Sheriff Beck, a tall man with cold eyes and a reputation for brutal efficiency. Behind the sheriff rode Tucker and several of his friends, along with faces Caleb didn't recognize, probably men brought in from other settlements. They were heavily armed and had the look of a posse prepared for serious trouble. "Stay inside," Caleb told Ayana, checking his rifle and moving toward the door. But Ayana was already rising from her chair, her movements careful but determined. "No, this concerns my daughter and me. I will not hide." Before Caleb could protest, she had opened the cabin door and stepped onto the porch beside him. Imala stayed just behind them, close enough to run inside if needed, but clearly unwilling to abandon her mother again. Sheriff Beck raised his hand, bringing the posse to a halt just outside the yard. His gaze moved from Caleb to Ayanna to Amala, and his expression hardened. Morrison Coy, he called out, his voice carrying the authority of legal office. I have warrants for the arrest of 2 Apache fugitives believed to be harboring on your property. You will surrender them immediately. On what charges? Caleb called back. Conspiracy to commit murder, theft of government property, and aiding enemy combatants, Beck replied smoothly. Standard charges for Apache found outside designated reservation boundaries. Caleb felt his anger rising. These were trumped-up charges designed to justify whatever the sheriff had planned. These are innocent people, a woman and a child. Apache are never innocent, Tucker shouted from behind the sheriff. They're all killers just waiting for their chance. Ayanna stepped forward slightly, and when she spoke, her English was clear and precise, with only the faintest trace of an accent. Sheriff Beck, I am Ayanna, daughter of Chief Manuelito. I claim the protection of the treaty signed between my father and Territorial Governor Wallace. Under that treaty, I have the right to safe passage to reservation lands without harassment or arrest. A murmur went through the posse. Several men exchanged glances, clearly not having expected to hear educated speech from an Apache woman. Sheriff Beck's jaw tightened. That treaty doesn't apply to suspected criminals, he said, and it certainly doesn't protect those who aid and abet Apache raiders. I have aided no raiders, Ayanna replied calmly. I am a mother seeking a reunion with my lost child. Nothing more. Your husband was a known war leader, Beck countered. That makes you an enemy combatant by association. My husband was a hunter who provided food for his family. He never raised a weapon against white settlers. The sheriff was growing visibly frustrated with Ayanna's articulate responses. This wasn't going the way he had planned. He had expected to find cowering victims, not an educated woman who knew her legal rights under territorial law. Enough talk, Tucker interrupted. We know what we came here to do. Let's get it done. Several men began to dismount their hands, moving to their weapons. The situation was rapidly escalating beyond words into violence. Caleb stepped forward, positioning himself directly between the posse and the Apache woman and child behind him. The first man who sets foot on my property without invitation will be shot, he said quietly. His voice carried across the yard with deadly certainty. You're one man, Morrison, Sheriff Beck said. Monsieur Tarmam. We were 12. Think carefully about your next move. I am, Caleb replied, and my next move is to defend my family. The word hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Family. Not guests, not refugees, not temporary charges. Family. Ayanna drew in a sharp breath behind him. Even Amala seemed to understand the significance of what he had just said. Your family, Beck laughed harshly. Since when do white men claim Apache squaws as family? The crude term hit Caleb like a slap. His hand moved to his gun butt, and several of the posse members responded by raising their rifles. Choose your words more carefully, Sheriff, Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet. That's my wife and daughter you're talking about. It was a lie, of course, but it was also somehow true in ways that Caleb was only beginning to understand. In the few days since Ayanna had arrived, the 3 of them had begun to form something that felt remarkably like a family unit. They worked together, ate together, protected each other. What more was family than that? Your wife, Beck's voice dripped disbelief. You married an Apache. I married a good woman who happens to be Apache, Caleb replied. Under territorial law, that makes her an American citizen entitled to the full protection of American law. This was actually true. The territorial statutes were clear on the matter, though they were rarely enforced when it came to Apache wives. But the legal technicality gave Beck pause. Behind Caleb, Ayanna spoke so softly only he could hear, You do not have to. Yes, I do, he interrupted, not taking his eyes off the sheriff. It's the truth, even if we haven't made it official yet. The standoff stretched taut as a wire. 12 armed men faced one determined rancher and the Apache family he had claimed as his own. In the silence, Caleb could hear Amala's quiet breathing and the distant call of a hawk riding the desert thermals. Finally, Sheriff Beck spoke. You're making a mistake, Morrison. A big one. This won't end here. I know, Caleb replied, but it ends today. You and your men turn around and leave my property. Now. For a moment, it seemed as though Beck might order an attack anyway. Several of the men behind him looked eager for violence, but the sheriff was a politician as well as a lawman, and he recognized that attacking a man defending his legally married wife might create more problems than it solved. "Move out," he ordered finally. But Morrison, this isn't over, not by a long shot. The posse wheeled their horses and rode away, but the tension they left behind was almost palpable. Caleb didn't relax until the last rider had disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he turn to face Ayanna, suddenly uncertain about what he had just committed them both to. "I'm sorry," he began. "I shouldn't have presumed. You saved our lives," she interrupted. "Again, and you called us family." "I meant it," Caleb said quietly. "If you'll have me." Ayanna studied his face for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. "Yes," she said simply. "I think, yes." Imala looked back and forth between the two adults, clearly not understanding all the implications, but sensing that something important had just happened. She moved to stand between them, taking each of them by the hand. For the first time in 3 years, Caleb Morrison felt like he had a family again. But as he looked toward the horizon where the posse had disappeared, he knew that the real challenges were just beginning. The weeks following Sheriff Beck's visit brought an uneasy peace to the Morrison cabin. Caleb and Ayanna had indeed made their marriage official, traveling to Messia under the protection of Dr. Hayes and two of his friends for the ceremony. It had been a simple affair witnessed by the doctor and the local minister, but it was legally binding under territorial law. What surprised Caleb was how natural the arrangement felt. Ayanna had slipped into the rhythms of ranch life as if she had been born to it. She proved to be an excellent cook, a skilled seamstress, and remarkably knowledgeable about animal husbandry. Her education had included practical skills alongside reading and writing. Imala had blossomed under the security of having both parents present. Her voice had returned completely, and she chattered constantly in a mix of English and Apache. She had taken to following Caleb around the ranch, eager to help with any task and full of questions about everything from the behavior of cattle to the patterns of clouds in the sky. But their newfound happiness was shadowed by the knowledge that they were living under a sword of Damocles. Beck had not returned, but other signs of hostility were unmistakable. Travelers who had once stopped to trade or share news now rode past without acknowledging them. Supplies from town became increasingly difficult to obtain. Most telling of all, several of Caleb's cattle had been found shot and left to rot, a clear message that the economic pressure was just beginning. "They're trying to starve us out," Caleb observed one evening as he and Ayanna sat on the porch after Imala had gone to bed. "Make it impossible for us to sustain ourselves here." Ayanna nodded. "It is an old tactic. Drive the enemy from their stronghold by making the stronghold impossible to defend. Your father taught you military strategy, along with reading and writing." She smiled slightly. "My father taught me to survive. In Apache culture, that includes understanding how enemies think." Caleb reached over and took her hand. In the weeks since their marriage, physical affection had developed naturally between them. It had started with practical touches, helping her down from the wagon, steadying her while she recovered from her injury. But somewhere along the way, those touches had become lingering, then deliberate, then necessary. "Do you regret staying?" he asked quietly. "Never," she replied immediately. "Do you regret asking us to?" "Never." But privately, Caleb wondered how long they could hold out against the combined pressure of an entire territory that wanted them gone. Money was becoming tight, supplies were running low, and winter was approaching. If Beck and his allies could maintain their economic siege long enough, the Morrison family might be forced to choose between starvation and departure. The answer came in the form of an unexpected ally. Jake Carter had been Caleb's nearest neighbor for 5 years, running cattle on a spread about 10 miles to the west. They had always maintained cordial relations without being particularly close friends. Carter was a quiet man who kept to himself and minded his own business, qualities that Caleb respected. So when Carter's wagon appeared in the yard one morning, loaded with supplies, Caleb was both surprised and cautious. Times were too dangerous to assume anyone's motivations were purely friendly. "Morning, Caleb," Carter said as he climbed down from his wagon. "Thought you might be running low on a few things." Carter was a man in his 40s, lean and weathered like most ranchers, with gray eyes that missed very little. He nodded politely to Ayanna, who had emerged from the cabin, and smiled when Imala peeked out shyly from behind her mother's skirts. That's very kind of you, Jake, Caleb replied carefully. But I have to ask, aren't you concerned about what the townspeople will think of you trading with us? Carter shrugged. Figure that's my business, not theirs. Besides, he added with a slight grin, I never did like being told who I could or couldn't trade with. As they unloaded the wagon, Carter explained his reasoning more fully. He had been in town when Beck's posse rode back from their confrontation with the Morrison family. He had listened to their complaints and excuses, and he had drawn his own conclusions. 12 armed men against one rancher, his wife, and a little girl, Carter said, shaking his head. That doesn't sit right with me, regardless of politics or racial feelings. You don't have problems with my wife being Apache, Caleb asked directly. Carter paused in his unloading to consider the question seriously. I reckon every man has the right to choose his own wife, just like every woman has the right to choose her own husband. Color of her skin doesn't change whether she's a good person or not. It was a remarkably progressive attitude for the time and place, and Caleb felt a surge of gratitude for this unexpected support. There's something else, Carter continued, lowering his voice. Talk in town is that Beck's planning something bigger than economic pressure. Word is he's petitioned the territorial governor for a company of cavalry to come deal with what he's calling the Apache problem on your ranch. Ayanna went very still. Cavalry? How many men? 40 or 50 according to rumors. Enough to overwhelm any resistance. The implications were clear. If Beck couldn't drive them out through legal or economic means, he was prepared to use overwhelming military force. Against such numbers, even the most determined defense would be hopeless. When, Caleb asked? Soon, maybe a week, maybe two, depends on how quickly the governor responds to the request. That night, as they lay in the darkness of their bedroom, Caleb and Ayanna discussed their increasingly limited options. They could flee abandoning the ranch and everything Caleb had built over the years. They could surrender accepting whatever fate Beck had planned for them, or they could stay and fight knowing that they would almost certainly be overwhelmed. My father has warriors, Ayanna said quietly. If I could get word to him, that would mean war, Caleb pointed out. Apache warriors attacking cavalry would give Beck exactly the justification he needs for a wider campaign against your people. Then what do you suggest? Caleb was quiet for a long time thinking. Finally, he said, what if we made it impossible for Beck to claim we're a threat? What if we demonstrated publicly that we're just a peaceful family trying to live quietly? How? I have an idea, but it's risky, and it depends on there being more people like Jake Carter in the territory than there are like Tucker and his friends. Ayanna turned to face him in the darkness. Tell me. Caleb's plan was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of hiding from the community that had rejected them, they would force that community to confront the reality of who they were, and they would do it in the most public way possible. 3 days later, the Morrison family drove their wagon into Mesilla during the busiest part of the week, Saturday morning when ranchers and townspeople gathered to conduct business and socialize. Caleb wore his best clothes. Ayanna was dressed in a simple but elegant dress that showcased her education and dignity, and Amala wore the new clothes they had purchased weeks earlier. They drove straight to the center of town and stopped in front of the church. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered. Some faces showed curiosity, others hostility, and a few displayed the kind of ugly hatred that made Caleb's hand rest near his gun. But they also saw faces marked by uncertainty and conflict. People who had heard the rumors, but were now confronted with the reality of a well-dressed, obviously loving family that bore no resemblance to their preconceptions about savage Apaches. Dr. Hayes emerged from his office and approached the wagon with a welcoming smile. Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Morrison, young Miss Imala, how nice to see you in town. His loud, cheerful greeting served multiple purposes. It emphasized Ayanna's legal status as a married woman, used her proper title, and treated the family with obvious respect and affection. Reverend Patterson, the local minister who had performed their wedding ceremony, also appeared. He was a thin, earnest man who took his Christian duties seriously, including the commandment to love one's neighbors. I was hoping to see you again, he told Ayanna. I've been meaning to ask if you might be interested in helping with our literacy program. We're trying to teach reading to some of the Mexican families in the area, and we could use someone who speaks multiple languages. Ayanna's face lit up. I would be honored to help. The conversation was deliberately staged for the benefit of the watching crowd. Here was an Apache woman being invited to participate in community activities, demonstrating education and civilization that contradicted every stereotype. Other allies began to appear. Jake Carter rode up with several of his ranch hands nodding respectfully to the Morrison family. Even some people Caleb didn't know well stepped forward to offer cautious but genuine greetings. But not everyone was pleased with this demonstration of support. Tucker and several of his friends pushed through the crowd, their faces dark with anger. Behind them came Sheriff Beck, his hand resting significantly on his gun butt. "This is inappropriate," Tucker declared loudly, "bringing Apaches into our town pretending they're civilized people. It's an insult to every settler who's lost family to Apache raids." "These Apache killed my brother," another voice shouted from the crowd. The mood began to shift, the initial curiosity and uncertainty giving way to something uglier. Caleb felt the situation balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip toward violence at any moment. But then Ayanna did something unexpected. She stood up in the wagon, drawing herself to her full height, and addressed the crowd in clear, carrying English. "My name is Ayanna Morrison," she said, her voice steady despite the hostility surrounding them. "I am the daughter of Chief Manuelito, who has signed peace treaties with your government. I am the wife of Caleb Morrison, a good man who has shown me and my daughter kindness when we had nowhere else to turn." She paused, her gaze moving across the crowd, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "Some of you have lost family to Apache raiders. I grieve with you for those losses because I too have lost family to violence. My husband was murdered by men who wore the uniforms of soldiers but acted like bandits. My daughter and I nearly died in the wilderness before Mr. Morrison found us and offered us shelter." Her words created a ripple of unease through the crowd. This wasn't the defiant rhetoric they had expected from an Apache woman. This was reasoned, articulate explanation that forced them to confront the humanity of their supposed enemies. "I do not ask you to forget your loss or ignore the real conflicts between our peoples," Ayanna continued. "I ask only that you judge me and my daughter by our actions, not by the color of our skin or the blood that flows in our veins. We want only to live peacefully, to raise our child in safety, and to contribute what we can to the community that has become our home." When she finished speaking, the crowd was silent. Even Tucker seemed momentarily at a loss for words. In that silence, individual voices began to speak up. "She talks sense," someone called out. "Seems like good people to me," added another voice. "If Chief Manuelito signed peace treaties, maybe we ought to honor them." But Sheriff Beck wasn't about to let this demonstration of support change his plans. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Fine words," he said loudly, "but Apache are masters of deception. This could all be an elaborate ruse designed to make us lower our guard before the real attack comes." "What attack?" Dr. Hayes demanded. "This woman is asking to help teach children to read. Her daughter plays with dolls and asks questions about the stars. What kind of attack do you see in that?" "The kind that comes when we're not expecting it," Beck replied grimly. "Mark my words, harboring these Apache will bring death to our community. And when it does, the blood will be on the hands of everyone who supported them today." With that ominous warning, it turned and stalked away, Tucker and his supporters following. But a significant portion of the crowd remained, and their expressions had shifted from hostility to thoughtful consideration. The Morrison family spent the rest of the morning in town, conducting business and social visits with a growing number of people who seemed willing to give them a chance. By the time they loaded their wagon to return home, Caleb felt cautiously optimistic that they might have changed some minds and gained some allies. But that optimism was short-lived. As they crested the hill overlooking their ranch, they saw smoke rising from the direction of the cabin. Not the controlled smoke of a cooking fire, but the thick black smoke of a structure burning out of control. This time they hadn't just burned the barn, they had burned everything. The cabin was a total loss, reduced to smoldering ruins and scattered debris. The corral had been destroyed, the livestock scattered or killed. Even the well had been contaminated, filled with debris and dead animals. As they stood among the ruins of their home, Imala began to cry. Not the loud wailing of a child's tantrum, but the quiet, heartbroken sobs of someone who had lost everything important twice in her short life. Ayanna knelt beside her daughter, gathering her close, but her own eyes were bright with unshed tears. All their belongings, all the small comforts they had accumulated, all the physical evidence, of the life they had tried to build together. Gone. Caleb surveyed the destruction with cold fury building in his chest. This wasn't just property damage. This was a message written in smoke and ash: leave or face worse. But as he looked at his wife and daughter crying among the ruins, he felt his resolve harden rather than break. These people, his family, had suffered enough loss for one lifetime. They would not be driven from their home by cowards who attacked when no one was there to defend it. "We rebuild," he said firmly. "Right here, right now, we rebuild." Ayanna looked up at him through her tears. "Caleb, perhaps it would be better if—" "No," he interrupted. "This is our land, our home. We don't run from bullies and we don't give in to threats. We rebuild and we make it clear that we're not going anywhere." That night, they camped in the open, huddled around a small fire built from the wreckage of their former home. The autumn air carried a sharp chill that seemed to pierce straight through their clothes and into their bones. Imala had stopped crying, but she sat pressed against her mother's side with the hollow-eyed look of someone who had witnessed too much destruction for her young mind to process. Caleb stared into the flames, his jaw tight with suppressed fury. This wasn't just an attack on their property. It was an assault on everything they had tried to build together. The books Ayanna had been using to teach Imala to read English were ash. The small wooden animals he had carved for his daughter were charcoal and splinters. Even Margaret's photograph, the one linked to his past life, had been consumed by the flames. "I'm sorry," Ayanna said quietly, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "This is because of me, because I stayed. You would have been safe if—" "Don't," Caleb interrupted firmly. "Don't you dare blame yourself for what cowards did in the dark. This is about their hatred, not our choices." But even as he spoke, the words doubt gnawed at him. How many more attacks could they endure? How much could he ask Ayanna and Imala to sacrifice for his stubborn refusal to be driven from his land? Ayanna seemed to sense his inner conflict. She reached across the space between them and took his hand, her fingers warm despite the cold night air. "In my grandfather's time," she said softly, "when the white soldiers first came to Apache lands, many of our people wanted to flee rather than fight. They said it was better to live as wanderers than to die defending ground that might not be worth the cost." "What did your grandfather say to that?" "He said that some ground is worth defending, not because of what it is, but because of what abandoning it would cost your soul. He said that when you let fear choose your path, you stop being the person you were meant to be." Caleb studied her face in the firelight, seeing the strength and determination that had carried her through so much loss and hardship. "And what do you believe?" "I believe that home isn't just a place," she replied. "It's the place where you choose to make your stand, where you decide that love matters more than safety and that some things are worth fighting for even when the odds are against you." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses broke the night silence. Caleb's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, but then a familiar voice called out from the darkness. "Caleb, it's Jake Carter. I've got supplies and men with me." Jake Carter arrived just after dark, bringing not just supplies and 3 of his ranch hands, but something even more valuable: proof that they were not as alone as they had believed. Behind Carter's wagon rode Dr. Hayes and Reverend Patterson, along with several townspeople Caleb recognized from their previous visits to Mesilla. "Figured you might need some help," Carter said simply as he dismounted. But there was something more than casual neighborliness in his manner. His jaw was set with the kind of determination that suggested he had made a choice and was prepared to see it through regardless of consequences. Dr. Hayes came the next morning along with Reverend Patterson and several townspeople who had been moved by Ayanna's speech. They brought tools, lumber, and most importantly, their labor. "This isn't right," Hayes declared as he surveyed the destruction. "Burning a family out of their home. This isn't who we are." Over the next week, a remarkable thing happened. A new cabin rose from the ashes of the old one, built not just by the Morrison family, but by a community of people who had decided that supporting their neighbors mattered more than racial prejudice. The work began before dawn each day and continued until darkness made it impossible to see. Men who had never spoken to each other before found themselves working side by side, united by their shared commitment to rebuilding what hatred had destroyed. Women from town arrived with food and supplies, setting up a field kitchen that fed the workers throughout the day. Ayanna proved to be more than just a grateful recipient of help. Her knowledge of traditional Apache construction techniques, combined with the more modern methods the other workers knew, resulted in a cabin that was both stronger and more comfortable than the original. She showed them how to use adobe mixed with local clay to create walls that would stay cool in summer and retain heat in winter. Her understanding of the desert environment helped them position the building to take advantage of natural windbreaks and water flow patterns. Amala too found her place in the reconstruction effort. Though she was too small to contribute much physical labor, she became the project's unofficial coordinator, carrying messages between work crews and keeping track of supplies. Her bright chatter in 3 languages, Apache English and the Spanish she was picking up from Miguel and the other Mexican workers, helped break down barriers between people who might otherwise have remained suspicious of one another. But perhaps most importantly, the rebuilding project gave the wider community a chance to see the Morrison family as individuals rather than representatives of racial stereotypes. When Tucker and his supporters rode past and saw Ayanna working alongside the church ladies to prepare meals for the volunteers, it became harder to maintain the fiction that she was a savage threat to civilization. When they saw Caleb teaching Amala to handle tools safely while she helped with simple construction tasks, the image of a dangerous Apache raider's nest seemed increasingly absurd. Not everyone was convinced, of course. Tucker and his friends made a point of riding past the construction site with obvious disapproval, sometimes shouting insults or making threats. Sheriff Beck posted notices around town warning people that associating with Apache sympathizers might be considered treasonous behavior. But enough people ignored these warnings to make the rebuilding possible. More than possible. It created a network of allies and friends that the Morrison family had never expected to find. Hayes appointed himself as the project's medical officer, treating cuts, bruises, and the occasional more serious injury that inevitably accompanied construction work. But he also served as an informal counselor for workers who were struggling with their own prejudices and assumptions. "I've been thinking," he said to Caleb one evening as they sat around the fire after a long day of construction work, "about what makes some people able to see past differences while others get stuck in hatred and fear." "Come to any conclusions?" Caleb asked. "I think it comes down to whether people see others as individuals or as symbols," Dr. Hayes replied. "Tucker looks at your wife and sees Apache, everything he's ever been told about Apache people, every fear and prejudice he's absorbed. But the women who worked with her in the kitchen today saw Ayanna, a woman who knows how to organize a meal for 30 people, who remembers everyone's preferences, who works harder than anyone else, and still has energy left to tell the stories that make children laugh." Reverend Patterson nodded thoughtfully. "It's much harder to hate someone when you know them as a person rather than as a category." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Miguel's oldest son, Carlos, who had ridden out from town with news. "Senor Morrison," the boy said breathlessly, "my father sent me to warn you. Sheriff Beck has been meeting with men from other counties. They are planning something big, maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after." The mood around the fire shifted immediately from philosophical discussion to practical concern. If Beck was bringing in outside help, it meant he was escalating beyond local politics into something potentially much more dangerous. "How many men?" Caleb asked. "My father thinks maybe 20, maybe more. Some of them wear cavalry uniforms." Ayanna and Caleb exchanged glances. Military involvement meant that Beck had somehow convinced his superiors that the Morrison Ranch represented a genuine threat requiring armed response. "We need to be ready," Caleb said quietly, "but we also need to be smart about this. If Beck wants to portray us as dangerous, we can't give him the excuse he's looking for." Over the next 2 days, as the new cabin neared completion, an interesting thing happened. Instead of scaling back their support in the face of increased danger, more people stepped forward to help. It was as if the threat of violence had crystallized their understanding of what they were really fighting for. Jake Carter brought not just his own ranch hands, but several neighbors Caleb had never met before. The Mexican families from the valley south of town arrived en masse, bringing not just labor, but a fierce determination that spoke of their own experiences with discrimination and persecution. Even some of the townspeople who had initially been skeptical found themselves drawn into the effort. Maria Santos, who ran the local dry goods store, closed her shop for 2 days to coordinate supply deliveries. Henry Walsh, the blacksmith, set up a portable forge on site to make the specialized hardware the new cabin required. The new cabin was larger than the old one, with a separate room for Amala and improvements that reflected the skills and generosity of its builders. Adobe walls provided insulation against both heat and cold. Wide porches offered shade in summer and protection from winter storms. A root cellar dug into the hillside behind the house would keep food fresh year-round. But beyond its practical improvements, the new cabin represented something profound. Proof that a community could choose inclusion over exclusion, cooperation over conflict. Every beam and board had been placed by hands from different backgrounds, working together toward a common goal. When it was finished, Reverend Patterson held an impromptu blessing ceremony, declaring it a testament to the power of community and Christian charity. That evening, as the Morrison family settled into their new home, Caleb felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They had been tested by fire, literally, and they had emerged stronger than before. But their trials were far from over. 2 days later, a cavalry patrol rode into their yard. 43 soldiers led by a young lieutenant who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else in the world. "Mr. Morrison," the lieutenant called out, remaining mounted. "I'm Lieutenant Davidson, 7th Cavalry. I have orders to investigate reports of hostile Apache activity on your property." Caleb stepped onto his porch, Ayanna and Imala appearing behind him. The sight of his mixed family seemed to confirm whatever briefing the lieutenant had received. "There's no hostile activity here," Caleb replied calmly. "Just a rancher and his family trying to live peacefully." "Sir, I have reports that you're harboring Apache fugitives. I'm going to have to ask you to surrender any Apache individuals for questioning." "Lieutenant," Ayanna said, stepping forward. "I am Ayanna Morrison, legal wife of this man and daughter of Chief Manuelito. Under the treaty signed by my father and your government, I am entitled to protection, not detention." Lieutenant Davidson looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I have my orders." "What exactly are those orders?" Caleb asked. "Are you here to arrest peaceful citizens? Are you here to break up a legal marriage? Or are you here because Sheriff Beck filled your commanding officer's ears with lies and prejudice?" The young officer's discomfort was obvious. It was clear that his briefing had led him to expect dangerous criminals, not an articulate family living quietly on their own land. I need to report back to my commanding officer," he said finally. "But ma'am," he added, addressing Ayanna directly, "you might want to consider relocating to the reservation for your own safety. Tensions in the territory are running high." "This is my home," Ayanna replied with quiet dignity. "I should not have to choose between my home and my safety." After the cavalry patrol left, the Morrison family knew that time was running short. Lieutenant Davidson might be reasonable, but his commanding officer had been influenced by Beck's reports. Military intervention was becoming more likely, not less. That night, they held the family council around their kitchen table. "We could still leave," Caleb said, though his heart wasn't in the suggestion. "Take what we can carry and head north to Colorado Territory, start over somewhere else." "Running solves nothing," Ayanna pointed out. "These same prejudices exist everywhere in your country. We would face the same problems in a different place." "Then what do you suggest?" Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. Finally, she looked up with the expression of grim determination. "We make our stand here," she said simply, "not with guns, not with violence, but with truth. We force this community to decide what kind of place they want to be." "How do we do that?" "We call their bluff," Ayanna said. "Beck claims we're a threat to the community." "Very well, let the community decide for themselves whether that's true." Her plan was as audacious as Caleb's had been, but in a different way. She proposed to invoke an ancient Apache tradition of trial by community judgment, adapted to fit territorial law. She would present herself to the townspeople of Mesilla and demand a formal hearing on the charges Beck had been spreading about them. "If we're truly guilty of being a threat," she explained, "then let them prove it in open court with evidence and witnesses. But if they cannot prove it, then let them publicly acknowledge our right to live here in peace." It was a dangerous gamble. Such a hearing could easily turn into a mob trial with a predetermined outcome. But it was also their best chance of settling the matter once and for all without violence and bloodshed. 3 days later, the Morrison family once again drove their wagon into Mesilla. But this time they were not alone. Jake Carter and his ranch hands flanked them, as did Dr. Hayes and Reverend Patterson. Word had spread throughout the territory about the upcoming hearing, and people had come from as far away as Las Cruces to witness the proceedings. The hearing was held in the largest available space, the church with pews packed and people standing along the walls. Territorial Judge Franklin presided, an elderly man with a reputation for fairness and adherence to law rather than popular opinion. Sheriff Beck served as the prosecutor, presenting his case against the Morrison family with passionate rhetoric about Apache threats and the danger of harboring potential enemies. He called witnesses who testified about Apache raids in other parts of the territory, though none could point to any hostile action by Ayanna or Imala specifically. Then it was Ayanna's turn to defend herself and her family. She stood before the packed church with quiet dignity, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the building as she told their story. She spoke of her education, her father's peace treaties, her husband's murder, and their flight to safety. She spoke of Caleb's kindness and the gradual growth of love and trust between them. She spoke of her daughter's trauma and recovery, of their simple desire to live peacefully and contribute to their community. But most powerfully, she spoke of choice. The choice between fear and understanding, between prejudice and justice, between the kind of community that welcomed neighbors and the kind that destroyed them. When she finished, the church was silent. Even Beck seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Judge Franklin deliberated for less than 10 minutes before rendering his verdict. "I find no evidence of hostile intent or criminal activity on the part of the defendants," he declared. "Mrs. Morrison is a legal citizen of this territory by virtue of her marriage to Mr. Morrison. She and her family have the same rights and protections as any other citizens. Furthermore, I find the charges brought by Sheriff Beck to be without foundation in law or fact." The courtroom erupted in mixed cheers and protests. Beck's supporters were outraged, but they were outnumbered by people who had been moved by Ayanna's testimony and convinced by the evidence, or lack thereof. But Judge Franklin wasn't finished. However, he continued, raising his hand for silence. "I am deeply troubled by the reports of property destruction and intimidation that have been directed at this family. Such actions are criminal and will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I hereby order that any further harassment of the Morrison family will result in immediate arrest and imprisonment." As they left the church, the Morrison family was surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. Even some people who had been skeptical before seemed convinced by what they had heard. Sheriff Beck pushed through the crowd, his face dark with anger. "This isn't over," he snarled at Caleb. "Legal tricks won't protect you forever." "They're not tricks," Caleb replied calmly. "They're called rights. Maybe you should look into them sometime." That night, as they celebrated in their rebuilt cabin with friends and neighbors, Ayanna finally allowed herself to believe that they might have found peace at last. But peace, as she had learned long ago, was always fragile on the frontier. Beck's final attempt came 3 weeks later, in the dark hour before dawn. 25 men surrounded the Morrison cabin, not to arrest or intimidate this time, but to kill. They had given up on legal remedies and community pressure. This was to be a massacre disguised as resistance to Apache raiders, with the Morrison family's bodies as evidence of the threat they had posed. But Beck had underestimated the network of friends and allies the Morrisons had built. Jake Carter had been watching Beck's movements, and when the sheriff gathered his men for what was obviously a final assault, Carter sent riders to every ranch and homestead that had supported the Morrison family. As Beck's men crept through the pre-dawn darkness toward the cabin, they found themselves surrounded by nearly 30 defenders who had taken positions in the hills and brush around the property. The battle, when it came, was brief but decisive. Beck's raiders, expecting to face only Caleb and his family instead, found themselves caught in crossfire from multiple directions. Several were wounded, and the rest surrendered quickly when they realized the hopelessness of their position. Beck himself was captured alive, along with enough evidence of his conspiracy to ensure criminal charges that would stick. As the sun rose over the New Mexico territory that morning, it shone down on a ranch where 3 cultures, Anglo, Apache, and Mexican, had come together to defend the simple principle that good people deserve to live in peace, regardless of the color of their skin. 6 months later, Ayanna gave birth to a son they named Samuel after Dr. Hayes, who had delivered him. Imala doted on her baby brother, chattering to him constantly in the mixture of English and Apache that had become the household language. The ranch prospered, supported by a strong network of friends and trading partners who had learned that diversity could be a source of strength rather than division. Ayanna's literacy classes had expanded into a full school that served children from 3 different cultures, preparing them for a future where understanding would matter more than prejudice. On a warm evening in late spring, as the family sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Caleb reflected on how much their lives had changed since that day, when he first found a frightened Apache girl stumbling across the desert. "No regrets?" he asked Ayana, who sat beside him with baby Samuel sleeping in her arms. "No regrets," she confirmed. "We chose each other, and we chose to stay. That made all the difference." Imala looked up from the wooden horse Caleb had carved for her. "Papa," she said. She had taken to calling him Papa after Samuel's birth. "Tell me again about the day you found me." "Which part?" Caleb asked, settling back in his chair. "All of it," Imala said. "Tell me about how we became a family." And so as the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Caleb Morrison told the story of a widowed rancher, an Apache widow and a little girl who had all found each other when they needed it most. It was a story of loss and recovery of prejudice, and understanding of the courage it took to choose love over fear. It was their story, and it was enough to build a future on. Thank you for joining us for this emotional journey through the American frontier. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of love, courage, and the power of family. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from viewers around the world. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most powerful stand we can take is simply refusing to let hate win.